There's a big review today. We'll try to respect your time. It almost hit me in the face. The gaming performance uplift of the RTX 5090 in rasterization for 4K is between 20 and 50% depending on the title versus the RTX 4090. Ray tracing at 4K is commonly 27 to 35% uplift depending again on the title. It's also without FSR in some of those scenarios, with FSR and others. We'll talk about that today. And then there's an additional storyline to this review, which is that the 9800X3D remains a completely insane, in a good way, CPU. It can keep up even at 1080p in situations with the 5090. Now, that's also where the 5090 starts to drop some of its performance gains relative to the 4090, because at 1080p, 1440p, even when it's not really that CPU bound, the performance uplift starts to come down. Thermally, this card also, just to save you the time, if this is all you care about up front, does better than we might have expected, even with all of the discussions and showing the prototype and all of that stuff. So for GPU thermals, we were overall pretty happy with it. We'll show you those numbers. For memory thermals, it's warmer than we would like. It's not dismal, but it's warmer than we'd like to see. So today we're looking at game performance, efficiency, thermals, acoustics, ray tracing, power consumption, and the FPS per watt number that comes from the efficiency testing. So let's get into it. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly's Aeronaut and Hydronaut thermal pastes. Aeronaut is Thermal Grizzly's entry-level thermal solution, marketed as resistant to curing and for long-term endurance. Hydronaut is Thermal Grizzly's next step up, targeted for overclocking and higher performance applications. We've used Hydronaut on a lot of our systems internally over the years. You can learn more at the link in the description below. First of all, we have a ton of content coming up, so make sure you check back regularly over the next few days and subscribe to catch it, because we're going to be looking at how this card, specifically the Founders Edition model, influences things like CPU thermals, not just the GPU, because of that dual flow-through approach. We tested that in the past, but now it's shoving even more warmed air straight up into a CPU tower potentially. So we're going to look at that. We have mini ITX case testing with this model specifically coming up, because with, again, that dual flow through, a lot of the benefit from this two-slot design comes from pushing the air through surrounding the PCB. The PCB is centered now, and that performance is potentially going to be affected. Well, it will be affected when you shove a giant wall behind it for sandwich style. So that's some of what we're looking at coming up. We have PCIe version testing, as well as a PCIe Gen 5 card. And then we also have the teardown coming up immediately later today or tomorrow. Normally for these Founders Edition models, it doesn't warrant really much discussion in the review of the GPU itself. This one does, though, but we'll keep it short. The RTX 5090 Founders Edition moves to a two-slot design and uses that dual flow-through configuration. So they've sandwiched the PCB centrally, and they've offset the PCIe slots. That foot is offset to the side of the PCB, and it's down as a result. That also means that NVIDIA needs a separate PCB for the I/O at the back, which feeds the monitors connected via a flex cable to the main PCB with the GPU. So to get a two-slot cooler capable of handling 575 watts or more, NVIDIA is using liquid metal with a triple-walled gasket to both contain the liquid metal and prevent exposure that could change its consistency and efficacy. The FE model does a lot of small things to improve performance, like exhausting the air out of the top of the card. You can see that here in our Schlieren imaging that we're doing later in this review. And that's actually really interesting to look at, because it pushes the air this way, and so it's moving it away from the fan inlet. So if you've got it socketed in a case like this, in theory, it should push the air straight up and into a glass wall and then help basically pull it out towards the exhaust fan if you have one in the case. That is imaged really well on Schlieren photography, so we're excited to show that, because that's always a really fun test to run. We have a full separate video about the engineering of the cooler with this guy, Malcolm Gutenberg, the lead thermal engineer on the FE card. He breaks down the changes. Check that video out if you want more. It's linked below. The NVIDIA RTX 5090 is supposed to be $2,000 and will have official availability on January 30th, joined by the $1,000 MSRP RTX 5080 on the same date. NVIDIA also has the 5070 Ti and the 5070, launching in presumably February for $750 and $550. The NVIDIA RTX 4090 had an MSRP of $1,600. Then later, it was regularly priced around $2,000 to $2,500 due to shortages and demand, and it's basically out of stock now, except at absolutely terrible third-party seller prices. The RX 7900 XTX is AMD's closest competitor. Pricing is around $870 or so to $900. The company also bowed out of the high-end race. The 9070 and the 9070 XT, that's AMD's next cards, should be coming out sometime by March or so. And then for Intel, because they are actually very relevant right now, they're currently only fighting at the low end and the mid-range. So the closest comparison on gaming charts to the 5090 today is going to be the 4090. A little weird to look at it that way. And to add some other historical flagships, we've got the 3090 Ti, the 2080 Ti, and we threw the 3090 in here as well. And then we have the 7900 XTX, the 6950 XT, and the 7900 XT on the AMD side for the high end. For other stuff to consider, this is 32 gigabytes of video memory. It is on now GDDR7. That's a big change. So a lot of the benefits where we see them at the higher resolutions, we think, we're not 100% sure, we can't inspect it at that depth, but we think it's coming from memory bandwidth and probably from some of the cache changes. This is also a Blackwell architecture solution, so that follows Ada Lovelace, that was the 40 series, and it's introduced alongside multi-frame generation, or MFG, and DLSS4. We'll talk about those two subjects in a separate video. It's too much to shove into this one. The 5090 is also a true PCIe Gen 5 device, so we'll look at that separate piece for the differences in that as well. Now, if you want to see our testing methodology, we've published a test bench list and the list of games and their settings on our living document webpage, so it saves time in the videos. If you want to go look at what we're using, you can click on that link in the description, and that'll get you the quick answers to what we're doing for our testing and our approach. It doesn't have every single answer, but we're slowly adding to it with each review cycle. That has the test bench hardware, the settings, the games, and the game settings. All right, there's going to be dozens of charts today. So, to get through it as efficiently as possible, as you can see, I'm entering Rossmann mode for speed. Here's a thermal chart running the RTX 5090 under its Auto V-BIOS fan curve with a Port Royal RT stress test at 4K. GPU temperature plots at about 72 degrees Celsius once it hits steady state for overall temperature when tested in a controlled room ambient of 21 to 22 degrees Celsius. This GPU temperature is genuinely impressive considering the size of the card, and that's important to remember. At 4 slots, 72 degrees would be acceptable. At 2 slots versus that 4-slot monster that we've seen for the last few years from everybody, this is an excellent result given the size. The point being that even if it were 4 slots, this would still be about what we'd expect, and maybe that's what it would be if they didn't use liquid metal. Our prototype testing already told us what NVIDIA can do with a fully committed, fatter design if you're curious what that'd look like. Memory temperature ran warm, unfortunately, at 89 to 90 degrees Celsius. This is higher than we'd like to see, especially considering it could be warmer in certain case configurations with a higher internal ambient temperature. This is technically still within TJ Maxx of the memory modules as far as we could find. So there isn't an imminent threat to the card, but this would be an area for NVIDIA to focus on improving. Our primary concern is in hotbox cases specifically, or small form factor solutions, which we're looking into as a follow-up that you all should check back to the channel regularly for. But in most high airflow ATX cases, although higher than we'd like to see, it is okay. Adding GPU fan speed to this chart, the fans both hit around 1570 RPM. We should get to acoustic testing for more on this. We took the RTX 5090 to our hemi-anechoic sound chamber to evaluate it. A good GPU temperature is an achievement at this size, but that can always be done by just blasting the fan speeds and compromising on noise levels. So, we ran the card at the default fan RPM that the card set itself to at steady state under our thermal workload that we just looked at. Here's the frequency spectrum plot. In our acoustic chamber with a noise floor of about 14 to 14.5 dBA on the day of testing, the RTX 5090 was measured in our passive test bench at about 32.5 dBA total. That's at 1 meter distance. The RTX 5090 had some spikes during testing, including above our frequency cutoff, but overall it has a very gradual curve for the plot. The limited presence of peaks and spikes in this plot help illustrate the relative uniformity of that fan whir noise, which we subjectively think helps blend it into the background more. Noise is subjective, so although this plot objectively tells us that there's a pain at 350 Hz and a bump in the plot around 515 Hz and then again around 2000 Hz, what matters is how that sounds. This is a sound sample for you to judge on your own. Note that this is not identical to the data we're presenting because we have to boost it for purposes of being level with our video audio, but listen for the type of noise, not for the volume, and you can decide what you think. So this is the Schlieren imaging of the 5090 Founders Edition, and you can see our light source here, and then that's hitting the mirror, and on the razor blade next to it, you're seeing the bounce back of the light, where we're kind of splitting the light in half as it re-enters the camera lens. So this is the Schlieren imaging setup, and if we pan over here, this is what we're actually showing. So what you just saw, I don't know, about 10 feet away, let's call it 3 meters for those of you in civilized countries, that is the imaging of this 5090 Founders Edition card, and specifically we have it oriented so that if you come straight on, the card is right in the middle of the mirror, and then these vents on the top, which are angled very slightly back, are ejecting the exhaust back the other way. So that's what we're going to look at with the Schlieren imaging, plus some of the other flow through. The middle of the mirror is almost perfectly level with the middle of the light source. And as for how all of this works, I'll walk you through the setup first. So we have a camera that's got some ND filters on it, so 1/16 right now. As for the principles of physics for how this works, I'll explain it to you. I have no fucking idea. All I know is we bought stuff and followed internet videos, and it works. Why does it work? I don't know. But I know when it doesn't work, and this is what works. If you'd like to learn about the science of it, there's a whole Wikipedia page. Really what we're looking for is we know the direction the air is going to move based on where the fans are. What we don't necessarily know is how does it circulate or recirculate. What it's showing is the air density gradient, or the change in the air density. So hot versus cold air has different density. It's cool because simulation can do this stuff, but then we get to see it in practice with the Schlieren imaging configuration. Here it is. In our interview with Malcolm Gutenberg, he explained that.
And the beautiful thing is they're angled to reduce recirculation. So basically a pure aerodynamic change to redirect the airflow away from the inlet of the fan. You know, the PCB is slightly larger than the fan. So then there is airflow here that is then redirected those directions. And then when that airflow exhausts, we have, you know, we have these angled covers, which then direct airflow away.
Well, that'll be cool. We'll try to see if Schlieren can show it.
It'd be awesome. It'd be awesome.
In this image, we're looking at the GPU straight on, with it perpendicular to the camera frustum. This is where the fans are off, but the heat load has already started. You can see the density change as the hot air leaves the card passively. As the fans turn on, we see a sudden flare-up and movement of the air to the right through the flow-through area out the back and toward the CPU tower. What's super cool here is that we can see the air kick up and out to the right at a 20 to 30 degree angle or so. We can also see a really high flow area of air exiting from the fins at the outer edges of the heatsink design. This hyper-focuses the flow and reduces recirculation around the front of the card, which just means the whole design is incredibly efficient at getting air away from the board and into the case exhaust fans. Here's the table shifted to see more exhaust. The flow-through area has super high-speed exhaust, illustrating why flow-through is so much more effective than shoving air into a straight PCB wall. And this is a time-lapse of the fans spinning down at the end of the load and returning to passive cooling. Everything drifts up and away. This next angle shows the card on the left and centered. The most interesting thing we see is this straight line of air shot out from those fins at the outer edges of the fan diameter. This is what Gutenberg was talking about in our interview, where they're capitalizing on the area of most efficacy for the fan blade. Finally, here's the card straight on, where we can see the amount of air just shot up and out. You'll want to choose cases with some spacing between the glass panel and the card to help get that warmed air away faster. Let's take a look at frequency. The next line plot is to ensure the GPU is functioning properly and meets the spec NVIDIA publicly claims. NVIDIA claims the 5090 runs at 2.01 GHz base and 2.41 GHz boost, with room for that to change based on the load. Assuming the software monitoring is correct for this new architecture, we measured about 2600 to 2700 MHz during the test. Commonly, 2600 to 2650. The RTX 4090 ran at about 2745 in the same benchmark back when it launched and when we tested it. Frequency clearly isn't everything though. It's higher on the 4090 by these numbers, and it's common that higher end configurations bring frequency down in some capacity. It's also true that architectural differences make the frequency indirectly comparable. So this frequency number isn't everything, but what it does tell us is that the card is exceeding the specification advertised by NVIDIA, so it's running as expected, which is good. And now it's time to get into the gaming benchmarks. Everyone is jumping to this timestamp. In Final Fantasy XIV at 4K, the 5090 ran at a comically high 182 FPS average, with 1% lows that were nearly identical to the average frame rate of the 4090. That makes it 31% higher frame rate than the RTX 4090. for average frame rate, to be clear. For a quick value discussion, the RTX 5090 is supposed to be $2,000, with the RTX 4090's MSRP originally being $1,600, though it was commonly in the $2,000 range. The 4090 is not commonly available anymore at this point, for a reasonable price at least, so just MSRP to MSRP, the 5090 is 25% more expensive and 31% higher frame rate in this test. The memory capacity increase benefit isn't seen in this game, which is expected. That'd be more of an impact in professional applications like maybe Adobe Premiere, 3D work, or machine learning workloads. The RX 7900 XTX ran at 104 FPS average, the same as when we tested it in December, so there's been no change, which gives the 5090 a lead in this rasterized benchmark of 74%. The 0.1% lows are about the same between these devices at the top end. That mostly comes down to specific game level frame pacing. We might look at that later in frame times in this video. Prior NVIDIA flagships include the RTX 3090 Ti at 88 FPS average, meaning the 5090 has doubled that performance. The frame time pacing was excellent on the 3090 Ti, as it closely follows the average. The 3090 was more or less a flagship as well, and at 77 FPS average, the non-Ti version. The 6950 XT was also once a flagship, closer to the RTX 3080 levels for performance here. The RTX 2080 Ti held a 54 FPS average, meaning that 5090 owners would see an increase of 237% over the 2080 Ti. At 1440p, the 5090 again continues the comically high frame rate by running at 317 FPS average. This has it about 17% ahead of the RTX 4090's 272 FPS average. The advantage has been trimmed here, which could be because of an encroaching CPU bottleneck or because of some differences in the architecture and the memory bandwidth. 1080p will help us answer that. For games like this, you'd really need a high-end CPU and ideally a more intensive resolution to get full use and value out of the 5090. Since we're bottlenecked, we'll move along, but quickly stop to look at 1080p, just for fun. If you thought the previous frame rate was funny, cast your sights upon the 407 FPS average at 1080p. Sorry, that's 407.1 FPS average. That was a close one. As we all know, 407 is below the threshold of acceptability for the modern gamer. Actually, humans can't see below 407 FPS average or at it, so the 0.1 is what makes it visible to human sight. That 0.1 FPS is critical, and it's what pushes it into playable territory. In maybe serious news, the 4090 is at 376 FPS average here. That means the 5090 is still about 8% ahead. This test really is just for fun, though. It's a good reminder that limitations of even a 9800X 3D will simply restrict how much you can get out of a card like a 5090 at these lower resolutions. Black Myth Wukong is relatively new to our test suite and is tested using the built-in benchmark. We benchmarked it at 4K for this. Currently, we consider this test in our suite to be experimental, meaning our confidence in it is present, but lower than other tests as we evaluate its reliability. We've been moving toward removing its experimental status with each review. At 4K, and where we've only tested a handful of cards due to the intensive load, the 5090 ran at 86 FPS average with lows at 74 and 70. This has it 28% higher in average frame rate than the 67 FPS average of the RTX 4090. So far, we're seeing a few titles around this 30% number at 4K. Comically, the 1% lows, which for us is an average of the slowest 1% of frames, are higher than the average frame rate for any other card on this chart. In fact, the 5090's slowest 0.1% of frames are faster than the average frame rate of the RTX 4090. That's crazy. The 7900 XTX's 49 FPS average gives the 5090 a 74% lead. That is consistent with some of the other tests. The 3090 Ti gives the 5090 an 89% lead. Improvement over the 2080 Ti is enough to feel irrelevant as a percentage, but it basically takes it from completely unplayable to relatively fluid. At 1440p, Black Myth has the RTX 5090 at 130 FPS average, 23% improved over the RTX 4090's 106 FPS average. The low is also improved. The rapid rundown against other flagships is as follows. The 5090 has a 51% higher average frame rate than the 7900 XTX, 75% higher than the 3090 Ti FTW3 RIP EVGA, 99% higher than the RTX 3090 Master, and 189% higher than the RTX 2080 Ti former flagship. Black Myth Wukong is heavy enough that 1080p is still meaningful for spacing, even without ray tracing. The RTX 5090 ran at 160 FPS average with good frame time pacing, establishing 127 FPS and 116 FPS lows. The 160 FPS result has it 20% ahead of the RTX 4090, diminishing the earlier lead, which was 28% at 4K, 23% at 1440p, and now 20%. This isn't just a CPU limit, as we also saw in Final Fantasy, but it speaks to some other advantages on the 5090, especially at higher resolutions, at 4K, where we see it pull away, kind of like the ARC cards. We think the memory bandwidth is potentially a large part of that additional scaling. The RX 7900 XTX ended up 113 FPS average for performance, with the 3090 Ti, former flagship, at 94 FPS, and the 2080 Ti at 62. Starfield is up next. We haven't run that many cards for this at 4K, but we have a lot of 1440p data. We'll start with the more limited 4K dataset. At 4K, the 5090 held 108 FPS average with lows that were within expectations for this game. The 4090 ran 92 FPS average, giving the 5090 a lead of just 17%. That's lower than we've seen in some of the other tests. The lead over the 7900 XTX's 77 FPS average is 40%, with the lead over the 58.3 result for the 3090 Ti at 85%. The 3080 was down at 48 FPS average, with the 2080 Ti at 33 FPS average. AMD's 7900 XTX and 7900 XT are its highest end cards available for the company right now, but the 6950 XT was a good deal in the back half of its life. At 1440p, the RTX 5090 ran at 147 FPS average against the 132 of the 4090. This is down to a 12% uplift now. The 7900 XTX ran at 112 FPS average, a big improvement from its 4K result, as you'd expect, with the 4080 FE at 108 FPS average. The 4080 Super would be around 1 to 3% better here if we had retested it. There aren't many reasons you'd play this game at 1080p with an RTX 5090, but just for sake of sort of researching it in the data, the 5090 ran at 165 FPS average here, with the 4090 at 155. Although technically better for the 5090, we're effectively at the limits of the test platform here. Dragon's Dogma 2 is up next. This is another one that we added in 2024, and it's been heavy on GPUs and CPUs alike, depending on the test area. In this limited suite of cards, we have the RTX 5090 at 133 FPS average, leading the RTX 4090 by 35%. This is one of the largest gains we saw in our test suite. The 1% lows and 0.1% lows also scaled up, showing that frame time pacing wasn't at the expense of higher FPS. The RX 7900 XTX ran at 77 FPS average, with the 4080 FE at 72 FPS. Again, the 4080 Super would be at about 1 to 3% above that. The 2080 Ti from 2018 ran at 36 FPS average, and that's without RT. The improvement to the 5090 is 267%, which is enough that the number doesn't really feel like it means anything anymore. It brings it from not really playable to pretty good, and climbing the flagships, the 3090 Ti's 64 FPS average ends up giving the 5090 a 108% lead. At 1440p, the RTX 5090 FE climbs in frame rate to 189 FPS average, with extremely well-paced frame time consistency shown in the high 0.1% and 1% low values. The 5090 ends up leading the 4090's 156 FPS average by 21% and the 7900 XTX by 50%. The lead against these cards has fallen from the 4K results. Although we're in territory where it's not meaningful for the experience, it helped us to understand the behavior by looking at 1080p. The frame rate still increases, so we weren't totally bound by the CPU. The 5090 hits 214 FPS average, leading the 4090 by 13%. What's interesting is that the 4090 is now the same frame rate that the 5090 had when the 5090 was at 1440p. Cyberpunk is up now. We're testing with the Phantom Liberty expansion in-game in the expansion area. The RTX 5090 ran at 95 FPS average with lows at an impressive 81 FPS 1% and 77 FPS 0.1%. These lows are excellent numbers and are similar to what we saw in Black Myth Wukong, where the 5090's lows are outperforming the 4090's average. The improvement in average FPS was large at 50%, moving from 64 FPS average on the 4090. This is the biggest gain we've come across so far. Cyberpunk is very particular though, and sensitive to areas of the game. Checking with Wendell, his level 1 text team saw a similarly huge uplift in this test and in this area. The RTX 4090 had a large 32% lead over the RTX 4080 already. As for the older cards, the 5090 and 3090 Ti are in entirely different classes. The 2080 Ti is down at 27 FPS average and struggling to run, although to its credit, its frame time pacing in relation to the average is actually excellent. It's just that the frame rate is low. At 1440p, the RTX 5090 ran at 181 FPS average, with lows at 126 and 108. The RTX 4090 held a 137 FPS average, with the advantage of the 5090 being reduced boost to a still respectable but lower 33%. The 7900 XTX ran at 120 FPS average here, which has remained a good result considering the price of the 7900 XTX as compared to its neighbors. Now, that story is different if you look at it with ray tracing, but we'll get to that later. The RTX 3090 Ti ran at 91 FPS average here, with the 2080 Ti at 57. We were fully bound on the CPU at 1080p, so we'll skip that one. Dying Light 2 at 4K is another heavy load for these GPUs. The RTX 5090 shows a familiar scenario of the 1% and 0.1% lows, which represent the slowest frames in our test passes, outperforming the average frame rate of the 4090. NVIDIA has managed to move the needle for at least the flagships, which we think is partly thanks to cache and memory configuration changes. The 5090 leads the 4090 by 38%. Another impressive jaunt, not distant from what we saw with Phantom Liberty. The 7900 XTX did okay in this test as compared to the 4080. Those two are at least closer in price than the rest of these, but otherwise the 5090 runs 74% higher average frame rate than the 7900 XTX. However, it also costs about 127% more depending on what price the XTX is when you look. For professional users, of course, there's some more nuance where the memory benefit isn't accounted for in almost any gaming scenarios. That would be more in other applications. At 1440p, the 5090 holds a 216 FPS average against the 4090's 173. This has the 5090 25% ahead of the 4090, down from its lead of 38% at 4K. We won't burn chart time on it, but 1080p is only about 15 FPS higher. So part of this reduction in scaling is because we're starting to approach the CPU limit. Resident Evil 4 is up next, first rasterized and at 4K. The 5090 landed at 207 FPS average here, with lows running higher as a result of consistent frame pacing. The end result is a lead over the 151 FPS average of the 4090 by 37%, a lead over the 7900 XTX of 64%, and a lead over the 4080 of 101%. Against the prior flagships, the 3090 Ti landed at 89 FPS average, giving the 5090 an uplift of 133%. At 1440p, the 5090 continued scaling and hit almost 350 FPS average, with lows at actually ludicrous levels, with 281 FPS for 1%. This puts the 5090's average frame rate 25% ahead of the 4090's average frame rate. So we're seeing a reduction from the 37% that we saw at 4K. This is consistent with what we've observed elsewhere. The 7900 XTX held on at 232 FPS average here, followed by cards like the 3090 Ti at 162 and the 2080 Ti at 92 FPS average. At 1080p, we see there's still scaling all the way up to almost 400 FPS average, which is kind of crazy. This has reset our expectations of where the CPU ceiling is, at least for this game, and if anything, it just sort of shows how good the 9800 X3D is for keeping up so well. The gap between the 5090 and 4090 is around 9% here, so we're actually hitting external limits. And now we're moving to ray tracing benchmarking. This contains games like Black Myth and Cyberpunk, which tend to favor NVIDIA, and games like Resident Evil and Dying Light, and also Dragon's Dogma, which give some variety. Black Myth is first. This is an experimental chart, so once again, our disclosure is that experimental charts are labeled as such because we haven't fully finished researching them yet, so there's more chance of variable behavior that we don't expect. This particular title is considered experimental because its performance leans just so heavily in one direction that we want to slowly accumulate results to explore it further, but it does seem consistent with what's online. The 5090 ran at 88 FPS average here when we set to 4K. Now note the settings and the title here. This outperforms the RTX 4090's 65 FPS average result by 36%. It's a big jump. This is with upscaling, so it's not like for like with the 4K raster results. AMD's 7900 XTX ran at 20 FPS in this title, which is why we say it's NVIDIA favored. The 3090 Ti ran at 34 FPS average here. Skipping 1440p and going to 1080p with FSR to get more cards on the chart, here's where we land. The 5090 is at 158 FPS average here, leading the 4090's 120 FPS average result by 31%. Against the 3090 Ti, the 5090 leads by 103%, and against the 2080 Ti's 49 FPS average, it's about a tripling. The 4070 outperforms the 3090 Ti in this test when using FSR, with the entire top half of the cards outperforming the 7900 XTX. This test, again, is heavily favored for NVIDIA with the heavy ray tracing use. Dragon's Dogma 2 is up next. Again, we haven't done a ton of 4K ray tracing tests here because it's such a heavy workload normally, but the 5090 can handle it. The 5090 ran at 113 FPS average with lows at 97 and 94. The 4090 landed at around 85 FPS average, giving the 5090 an uplift of 33%. The RX 7900 XTX does better in this game compared to Black Myth, instead outperforming the RTX 4080 and 3090 Ti, the latter of which is at 55 FPS average. At 1440p, the 5090 jumped to 165 FPS average, and the 4090 held 136 FPS average, still keeping about a 30 FPS gap between them, or an improvement generationally of 22%. The uplift has fallen as compared to 4K, and keeping with prior trends, this is something that it looks like it just does better at higher resolutions, at least proportionally. And some of that is because of limitations externally, and some of it is just because of the memory bandwidth and some of the cache changes. The 7900 XTX does similarly here to last time, landing just ahead of the RTX 4080. At 1080p, the 5090 continues to climb to 194 FPS average, reducing the generational uplift to 15% over the 4090. Let's move on to something more interesting. Here's Dying Light 2 ray traced. Again, we haven't historically run 4K here because only the 4090 and 4080 could be argued as capable, and a chart with two cards is boring. It looks like this next generation of hardware, and hopefully that also includes AMD's next card, they're making promises about ray tracing, is going to change that. Maybe we'll see 4K more with this. The 5090 ran at 109 FPS average, leading the 80 FPS result of the 4090 by 37%. The 7900 XTX is led by 137%. AMD has publicly claimed that its next generation will significantly improve upon this, so we'll see where they land probably closer to March. At 1440p, the RTX 5090 ran at 176 FPS average and held lows of 152 and 126. The 176 result has it about 40 FPS, or 29% ahead of the 4090. The 4080 hit 104 FPS average with the 3090 Ti at 88 FPS, and our 2080 Ti was approaching a decent frame rate, but still falling short at 46 FPS average. At 1080p, the 5090 held 224 FPS average, mostly establishing that we weren't bound previously by the CPU. That's kind of the real reason we're doing this one. So when it was at 4K, the scaling was 37% generational improvement, and then at 1440, it was 29%, and now at 1080p, it's 24.5%. The reduction from 1440p to 1080p isn't as big as we might expect from other tests, probably because there remains enough GPU load to where the CPU isn't heavily taxed. Resident Evil 4 with ray tracing is up now, tested at 4K first. The 5090 ran at 210 FPS average using FSR as defined in the chart title. The 160 FPS RTX 4090 result establishes a 31% generational improvement favoring the 5090. The lead over the 7900 XTX is 56% here, with the improvement on the 3090 Ti 113%. We'll keep this short. At 1440p, the RTX 5090's lead falls to 23% over the 4090. This trend is consistent. Cyberpunk with the RT Ultra at 4K is heavy even for the RTX 5090 when not using some form of upscaling, which we toggle off in testing specifically because of how unreliable Cyberpunk's sticky settings are. The 53 FPS average puts the 5090 35% ahead of the 4090's 39 FPS average result, remaining consistent with prior tests. The poor old 2080 Ti nearly burst into flames trying to run this, holding an 8.8 FPS average as it crawled across the finish line. And finally, for the game benchmarks, 4K with RT Medium's interesting. Dropping from Ultra to Medium predictably increased the performance, but the gap grew between the cards with a 59 FPS average and a 40 FPS average result. Now we're getting into efficiency benchmarking and idle power consumption. For this, although we tested a lot of games, we're just going to simplify the charts here and look at a couple of game tests plus idle. These convey the whole story pretty well. Testing is done by measuring the GPU power consumption at the PCIe cables and the PCIe slot with an interposer. Although we initially had trouble getting the card to work on the riser due to PCIe generational differences, in the final literal hours before going live here, we found a solution to measure through the riser. This testing eliminates the remainder of system power consumption, so we're isolating for just the GPU. Testing idle power consumption, the 5090 Founders Edition landed at 46 watts on the desktop with our benchmarking approach. The 5090 FE measured lower in idle power draw than the Arc A580 and about the same as the A750. Even just sitting there, it's drawing a lot of power. Our testing uses the Windows High Performance Power Plan for benchmarking purposes, so switching to balanced may help reduce this. However, we use that power plan for all tests, so these are all like-for-like comparable. We measured the 4090 at 28 to 29 watts. The 5090 has relatively high idle power consumption with our test approach, and this is an area where clearly there's some room for improvement if only judging by the 4090. Although the power consumption of the TDP is higher on this card. Final Fantasy XIV at 4K is low on results since we just started using this for efficiency for this launch. The 4090 was the most efficient here at 391.7 watts to produce 138 to 139 FPS average. That puts it at 0.35 FPS per watt. The 5090 FE was efficient as compared to other cards we've tested here, but technically worse off than the 4090. Realistically, they're about the same. Despite frame rate improving by 31%, the power consumption also increased by 37%. The end result is reduced or equal efficiency versus the last generation. This might be why NVIDIA is pushing the narrative so hard that MFG improves efficiency. Except that's like saying, why compare apples to apples when you could compare apples to oranges? In the very least, against the 3090 Ti, actually like for like, we can see clear and massive iterative improvements. We're showing 1440p to get a wider selection of cards, although the lighter load won't look better for the 5090. The 5090 ended up around 520 watts average for this work, landing it at 0.61 FPS per watt. Efficiency is down comparatively overall, since we saw the performance advantage go down when at 1440p as compared to other cards. The cards should show the best gains in 4K RT workloads like F1 though. Here's F1 24 at 4K with ray tracing. On a technicality, the 5090 is the most efficient in this test. It pulled 569 watts on average during testing. It had spikes, not pure transients, but just spikes here of 580 to 590 watts. And because of the frame rate advantage over the RTX 4090 with its 428 watt draw, it ends up at 0.21 FPS per watt instead of 0.20. This isn't particularly exciting, and we have to highlight that NVIDIA's claims of efficiency improvements largely centered around artificially generated frames, which isn't like for like. It's not comparable. The frame itself may not be the same. So overall, it's looking like they're about the same efficiency as they were. All right, so wrapping this up, first of all, we need to get into NVIDIA's marketing because unfortunately, NVIDIA has once again stepped on every single rake that's been left on the floor of a hardware store on its way to selling its product that might otherwise be completely fine. This image shows the RTX 5090 as being 2 times faster than the RTX 4090 regularly, but as you all know from the review you just watched, that's not true. This chart doesn't have a big title that says different DLSS versions where we needlessly compare apples to oranges even though we have perfectly good apples to compare against each other and nothing to be shy of if we tested it properly. It says performance. NVIDIA technically lists the DLSS version in the bottom, but most people don't know what that means. NVIDIA's own line of gray text that blends into the background of the page at nearly the same color states the test configuration. This states that frame gen was used on the 40 series and that 4x multi-frame gen was used on the 50 series, which isn't like for like. NVIDIA is generating more artificial frames per real frame on the 5090 than the 4090, but they just list performance at the top of this chart and say it's 2x. NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang went on stage for the announcement of all this and said that the 5070 will bring 4090 performance to everybody for $550, which seems extremely questionable.
Wish me luck.
The decision to market any of it this way, it comes across as insecure and like NVIDIA's sensitive to the value that they're providing, or like the uplift's not good enough, as if to say the 5090, it's not good enough on its own. We need to put makeup on this chart to just make it feel like it is closer to what people want. It really comes across as just strange from NVIDIA. But anyway, enough of the marketing bullshit. The recap is this. First up, users of VRAM-intensive professional applications should consider the 5090 for different reasons, but we don't have that data for you today. Not sure if we'll run it, but maybe in the future. For gaming, anyone who isn't playing on 4K or higher resolutions won't get as much relative gain out of this card. Generally, we saw a 27 to 35% uplift in 4K gaming over the RTX 4090. In one instance, we saw 50%. In one RTN instance, we saw 44%. Most of the time, it's about 30% better at 4K. At 1440p, we saw that drop into the 20s, typically when not CPU bound. The card is one of the most power-hungry idle power consumers we've ever tested, and it's the most power-hungry card we've tested, period. The thing we're worried about is that NVIDIA has elected to push this much power through 12-volt high power. So there's some slot draw, but most of it is still going through that cable. The 12-volt 2x6 spec is a dumpster fire. It's the same for 12-volt high power. We have a whole video on it. You should check it out if you want to learn more. Efficiency is about the same between the 4090 and the 5090. Thermal design is excellent. The FE card impressed us in big ways, and NVIDIA managed to make this 2 slots and still in the 70s while not being ridiculously loud. It genuinely is an impressive cooler. They deserve every bit of credit for that. And that Malcolm interview, if you haven't watched it, you really should now, because now we have the thermal data to back up what he's saying. So that was nice to see. As far as the value, we'll be able to more easily talk about that next week when we can review the 5080. For now, NVIDIA is launching the 5090 first, which makes it hard for us to know how close the 5080 gets to the 5090. We don't want to make a value judgment right now when there's a car that's going to be $1,000 instead of $2,000, and when the 4090s are not really available anymore to make that comparison anyway. So we're going to hold off on that until the 5080 launches in a week, and we'll have that review with that information for you as soon as it does. That's kind of the recap. The performance uplift is there at 30-35% or something typically across the games. If you're in the audience buying a 5090, then we'd like to hear from you if you want to either sell it to us or I guess loan it to us, because we'd like to look at some more where, just because of how interesting this FE model is at 2 slots, I'm trying to get in some partner models of various sizes so we can just see, like, okay, so if it's a 4 slot but it's on paste, does that pull it to basically the same spot? Meaning, is that the key to success here? And there's testing we can do on this card to look at the two, and we'll have that for you. But if you're buying a 5090 and you want to sell it to us or loan it to us, you can email tips, T-I-P-S, @gamersnexus.net as soon as you've got some kind of confirmation you have one. We may not reply to everyone, but you can do that, and hopefully we'll see it. So thanks for watching. That's it for this review. There's a lot here to look at. Personally, I'm really excited about the thermal solution. For me, that's always the most fun part of this. Power is interesting too. Yeah, we'll have a lot more to talk about. So check back regularly over the next several days for that. Subscribe for more, and we'll see you all next time.